Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire, I'll be using both here, versus The Wheel of Time. People have been asking me to remake this video for quite a while, and with the recent growth on the channel and the death, or end, I guess is the more proper way to put that, of the TV show on HBO, Game of Thrones, I feel it is appropriate now for me to do a round two, a re-examination of what is A Song of Ice and Fire versus The Wheel of Time. Unlike last time, I'm not going to be diving in deep on like certain point-based systems, pulling them apart. What I'd rather do for this video, because it is a round two, would be to kind of just compare what the series are at their core, how they differ from each other while paralleling each other in odd ways, because both of the authors were absolute geniuses who did incredible things for the fantasy genre. George R. R. Martin's impact has certainly been more sudden and upfront with the incredible popularity of the Game of Thrones television series, while Robert Jordan has been more of a subtle influence that has kind of just existed since the publication of the first book of The Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World. And quickly dispelling a few dumb things I've seen people say, because I have to, it's how my brain works. If you're one of these people, I want you to stop. No, A Wheel of Time, because it's being turned into a TV show after Game of Thrones, is not stealing from Game of Thrones. It came out first, and vice versa. A Game of Thrones did not steal from The Wheel of Time, or Song of Ice and Fire did not steal from The Wheel of Time, really at all, because at their core concepts, they are incredibly different series. And that's actually what we're going to talk about first here when comparing the versus elements of these two series, what the author initially conceptualized. A Song of Ice and Fire is anti-fantasy, grimdark fantasy. What that means is George R. R. Martin's initial concept was, I want to go against the grain of the typical fantasy tropes and ideas and write a story that just feels like it has a lot of those similar elements, but almost none of the predictable story beats that the fantasy genre is known for. That's why he was oh so willing to kill off characters and make his magic system take a real back burner position to just character elements in a political thriller. He deliberately worked against the genre, which is not disrespectful to the genre at all. In fact, as a huge fan of the genre, I appreciate it immensely. The genre was stale for a few decades, and having someone come in who's willing to shake it up so much has had tremendous effect. The ripples of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones are being felt throughout all of fantasy-dom. Good job, Daniel. And will continue to be for decades, without a doubt. And George R. R. Martin also contributed to the rise of grimdark fantasy we are seeing. Grimdark fantasy, the series that already existed before the popularity of Game of Thrones, and the new ones being written, are all seeing better reception because a fandom of this type of fantasy has been sparked and reinvigorated to dive back in, because they've been shown that this material is out there. A Song of Ice and Fire might be one of the most approachable series for non-fantasy fans because of its anti-fantasy approach and the grimdark elements pulling in more of the people who like watching torture stuff. I personally am not a huge fan of grimdark, but I have massive amounts of respect for what A Song of Ice and Fire accomplished. What I really do consider its sister series, The Wheel of Time, actually parallels it in some beautiful ways. But let's first jump into The Wheel of Time's initial concepts. There is a fantastic interview with the author of Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan, that is put at the end of most of the audiobooks, where he talks about his initial concepts for creating the Wheel of Time. Now, unlike George R. R. Martin, who was doing an anti-fantasy approach, Robert Jordan looked at classic fantasy and its tropes and wanted to take a more realistic approach to what actual people's responses would be to these tropey elements occurring. So while the Wheel of Time does still have many fantasy tropes at its core, like the idea of a chosen one, a grand dark army that must be defeated, and a dark one, its focus is not on those tropey elements, but instead focusing on the people who live within this world and are surrounded by forces that are on a nuclear scale. Jordan also examined how race was used within many fantasy series. Before people get upset, I don't mean skin color, I mean like elves and orcs and dwarves. that kind of race, and instead decided to keep that to a minimum. Outside of the evil forces, there's really only one or two other alien races that exist within the Wheel of Time. Instead, he used culture as many fantasy authors use race, taking from real-world examples across the globe, blending their cultures, and having these new, interesting, deep cultures rooted in our own reality and have clear influences, but are fascinating to examine because they feel so new. The Aiel and the Seanchan being my two favorite separate examples. One that's an odd mixture of Asian, Roman, imperialistic mentalities, and the other being based off of several more tribal cultures, but resulting in this truly epic culture. So while the Wheel of Time loved fantasy and just wanted to refocus on other elements of what these typical story ideas would lead to, George R. R. Martin in A Song of Ice and Fire pulled against the wave of where the fantasy genre was going. I credit the Wheel of Time for really ushering in the age of modern fantasy. Jordan's focus on character and how people would actually feel, react, and exist in these situations was rare before the Wheel of Time. And with the Wheel of Time's monumental popularity within the genre, it clearly had shifting influences on several modern authors we see today. You can find quotes online from people like Brandon Sanderson, Brent Weeks, Patrick Rothfuss, and several other huge giants within the genre today saying how important and influential Robert Jordan's materials were to them. But that's what's interesting here. A Song of Ice and Fire, honestly, before the Game of Thrones television series, didn't have the level of influence that we're seeing it have now. And that brings us to a next level examination of A Song of Ice and Fire's influence here, something that is truly going to change not only the fantasy genre forever, but television and how we enjoy streaming services forever. There are over 90 different fantasy or sci-fi series currently being bought up by these various streaming services, all trying to capture the next Game of Thrones now that it has ended. And I'm sure with its mixed reception, to put it nicely, by the fans, they are salivating more than ever at their opportunity to make the next great one. And that's why I actually think The Wheel of Time is the perfect series to slip right in. It's not nearly as grimdark, but has mature themes that exist throughout it. It's not pulling any punches when it comes to gore. There is torture, sex, nudity, they all exist, but it's not quite on the level we ever saw in A Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, which was even bloodier than the show itself. So I do believe it has a more mass appeal now that this audience has been made aware that they can enjoy a fantasy series. I actually know several people who didn't watch Game of Thrones because they just said it was too violent for them. I think they're missing out. The first 5-6 seasons are truly spectacular, but I am very excited for them to give The Wheel of Time its fair shot, with its larger world, more in-depth, nuanced magic system that is truly brilliant. Cultures so deep they feel real. You want to go run off and be an Aiel, even though they'd probably kill you, and so much more. The Game of Thrones fan base is still looking for more. They want more fantasy. I don't think anyone's burnt out right now, especially with the fumbled ending. A lot of people don't feel like they got the catharsis they deserve. Step in The Wheel of Time, a series which was completed being writing by one of the best fantasy authors currently working, Brandon Sanderson, and an ending that was pretty much universally loved by fans. Obviously not going to get into it here, but it was well received. Pulling that all together with people really blaming the lack of the final 2 books being why Game of Thrones stumbled so hard, and none of the other fantasy shows I'm seeing being adapted being quite on the level of epic scope The Wheel of Time is, or even on the A Song of Ice and Fire scope, I think people want more epic fantasy, and guess who's next up to bat? I'm not saying every other show is going to fail. I just wanted to briefly examine the core differences at the root origins of these series and look at the results of the two and the potential results for a Wheel of Time TV show. There's going to be people online who claim like, oh, Wheel of Time is just riding the wave of Game of Thrones and I can't love it because Game of Thrones was first and that means everything to me because they're those people and they're weird. I don't get that. Just enjoy things, please, and let other people enjoy things. But I don't think I would have preferred this happening any other way. The Wheel of Time needs a large investment from the beginning to be able to land running. And with the success of Game of Thrones, I feel like studios are more than willing to throw the amounts of money at these fantasy series that they really do need to pull off the source material well. It almost is spelled out too perfectly. A Song of Ice and Fire was adapted and Game of Thrones was made. It gave us some of the best seasons in television history. It had a stumbled ending, which is unfortunate, but it's left a large fan base craving more and an actual catharsis to a fantasy series. Up steps The Wheel of Time, something that has more mass appeal, just as deep, nuanced characters, is already finished, has a massive studio behind it, one of the best magic systems ever, deep lore, political maneuvering, epic battles, I don't see where it can go wrong, as long as the show is done well. Sorry I kind of tricked you by saying this is a versus video. I'm actually trying to fight against the versus mentality that exists out there. I think these are brother-sister series at their core. The authors were friends with each other, or at least friendly. George R. R. Martin wrote a beautiful eulogy when Robert Jordan passed. I've never heard a negative word between these two, and I'm excited to see what George R. R. Martin thinks of the eventual Wheel of Time TV show. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this video and what you think the relationship between these two series is like. I'm really interested to see the conversation this video sparks. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Share the video if you wouldn't mind with some communities and people you think would like it. And hit the Patreon if you want to support directly what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Peace!